When we talk about famous scientists, we usually mean those whose research has led to groundbreaking innovations or discoveries. The name Jean-Henri Fabre probably doesn't ring a bell for most people. However, his work laid the foundations for modern entomology and inspired many future scientists, including the father of ecology, Eugene Odum. Fabre was a self-taught entomologist who made incredible discoveries in the field and managed to earn the title of the father of entomology. His works were fundamental for the development of this science, even though he was considered a nobody by the scientific community during his lifetime. Fabre dedicated his life to studying insects. He devoted more than 60 years to observing their behavior and eventually wrote one of the most comprehensive books ever, The Wonders of Insect Life, which is still relevant today. But that's not all. The scientist also had other hobbies. Let's find out what else fascinated him and how his life unfolded. Jean-Henri was born on December 23, 1922, in the French town of Camargue. There wasn't much to see there except vineyards and wheat fields. This part of France was known for its intense heat and poverty. Fabre's father worked as an excise officer and didn't have much money, so the family had to move from place to place following his job. Because of this, young Jean rarely stayed in one school for longer than a year, and consequently, he received a very incomplete education. At the age of 14, Fabre left school and started working as an apprentice to a miller. Then he served 2 years in the army. After that, he returned to his hometown and tried to make a living selling fabrics, but it didn't work out. All the time, Jean was passionate about nature, especially about insects. When he was just 7 years old, he already kept a journal where he wrote down his observations of animals and plants. The boy collected butterflies, beetles, and other insects, and after reading some books, he started to dissect them. That's how Fabre became one of the first scientists who studied the anatomy of insects. However, he didn't know that yet because at that time no one took the study of insects seriously. They were simply considered a nuisance. In 1837, Fabre decided to take a course of lectures at the University of Montpellier. He could have become a lawyer thanks to his talent for rhetoric, but he soon realized that this field wasn't interesting enough for him. So instead, he started to attend the classes of a renowned zoologist, Jean-Baptiste Bouvier, who later became the director of the Natural History Museum in Paris. It was under his guidance that Fabre's passion for insects flared up with renewed vigor. The scientist-to-be got completely carried away and spent all his free time exploring this topic. As a result, he spent several years repeating and expanding the experiments of his favorite teacher. Fabre began his career as a researcher by studying the anatomy of spiders and their larvae. It should be noted that in addition to his main work, Fabre combined it with other activities. For example, to support himself financially, he taught primary school. In 1850, Fabre's first work, a description of a little-known spider, was published in a scientific journal. Soon, another followed, and then a third. The scientist continued to share his research with the world, but no one paid any attention to them. The fact was that Fabre was not a university professor or an employee of a museum, which meant that his work did not receive much recognition. Even worse, his scientific articles were not taken seriously due to the poor quality of their design. In 1858, Fabre decided to sort out this situation and presented his research to the Natural History Society of his hometown. To his surprise, the presentation was well received by the audience, and a few months later, he was elected a member of the society. And this was only the beginning. He was invited to give lectures, and soon he became one of the leading experts on insect anatomy. In 1863, a scientist was offered a job at the Museum of Natural History in Paris. This was his dream job, but it was not without its drawbacks. The salary was very small, so Fabre had to keep looking for additional income. It was then that the scientist thought of writing a book about insects for a wide audience. He was sure that if he made his research understandable and interesting for everyone, and not just for specialists, he would finally get recognition. But Fabre never could have guessed that this book would become his most famous work. In 1867, his first book, The Book of Insects, was published. In it, Fabre shared everything he had learned during his many years of research. The book was a huge success, going through 4 editions in 3 years. Encouraged by this success, Fabre continued to write, and in 1879, his second work, The Wonders of Insect Life, was published. In the mid-19th century, Darwin's theory of evolution was hotly debated in the scientific community. The author of the theory of evolution had a lot of opponents. Fabre was one of them. According to the scientist, observations of insects do not confirm Darwin's conclusion that living beings change over time. This point of view was reflected in his book, which brought the scientist both fame and problems. You see, Fabre's work did not fit into the evolutionary concept that was being imposed in Europe at that time. Therefore, in 1886, the scientist was fired from the museum. No one dared to openly challenge Darwin, so Fabre's work was simply ignored. At that point, the scientist could have ended his career. After all, he had reached the age of 64 and his book was banned. But Fabre was not going to give up. He decided to continue his research and share his findings with the public in his own way. Starting from 1888, the scientist traveled around France giving lectures, and in 1890, his work was finally recognized. Fabre was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. The scientist had finally achieved recognition, but unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to enjoy it. On November 11, 1915, at the age of 73, Jean-Henri Fabre died. Throughout his life, the scientist had been plagued by lung problems, which worsened in his later years. Over time, they progressed to the point that he developed pneumonia and died. Now let's return to the book that made Fabre famous. We're talking about The Wonders of Insect Life, which consists of 5 parts. In the first one, Fabre describes the structure of the insect's body. In the second part, he talks about how insects breathe, reproduce, and care for their offspring. The third part is devoted to the senses of insects, while the fourth part tells about their intelligence. Finally, in the last part, the author shares his thoughts on human relations with insects. This book contains a huge amount of information that was previously unknown to scientists. For example, Fabre was the first to discover how dragonflies fly underwater, how grasshoppers jump, and how earwigs hold their prey. He also created a unique classification of insects according to their behavior. Moreover, the scientist described many new species of insects. Thanks to him, we learned that there are more than 500,000 of them in the world. Fabre was also the first to suggest that insects communicate with each other using special sounds. Another important work of the scientist was the book Souvenirs Entomology, which contains the results of his research. In total, Fabre wrote 15 books and about 300 scientific articles. Despite the fact that the scientist was a convinced opponent of Darwin's theory, he was considered a progressive thinker for his time. Fabre was one of the first researchers who rejected the idea that insects have souls. He believed that they don't feel anything when they die. This point of view was shocking for the contemporaries, but nevertheless, it was the beginning of a new understanding of insects. Fabre showed that they can feel pain, fear, and joy. All they need is to be understood correctly. The scientist's work had a huge impact on the development of not only entomology, but also other sciences. In particular, his observations of insects inspired the father of ecology, Eugene Odum, who used Fabre's research in his work. Even the famous writer Jules Verne mentioned Fabre in one of his letters, calling him the greatest specialist in his field. And what's most interesting, the scientist's research is still used today. For example, Fabre's work helped scientists learn how locusts migrate and why cicadas only chirp in the evening. So, to sum up, Jean-Henri Fabre was a brilliant scientist and writer who devoted more than 60 years to studying insects. His research helped to look at these creatures in a completely new way, and his books are still relevant today. Although the scientist passed away more than 100 years ago, his contribution to science is still remembered and continues to inspire new discoveries.